Congratulations, failure. We're finished. Those were the words my husband, Carter, toasted me with at my own birthday dinner, in front of 40 of our so-called friends. The laughter hit me harder than a slap. I sat there, frozen for a moment, surrounded by people clinking glasses and whispering, pretending to be shocked while secretly entertained. My husband, the man I'd built everything beside, stood tall and smug, his hand resting proudly on the thigh of Sienna, his new toy. But instead of breaking, I smiled. Calmly, quietly, and as the laughter echoed through the restaurant, I slid a single black envelope across the table and said, "Before you celebrate, explain to your parents why their mansion vanishes, to your sisters why their trust funds are frozen, and to your partners why your company is dead before dessert is served." The moment his confident smirk faltered was priceless. I watched his fingers tremble as he tore the envelope open. I didn't stay to see the panic fully bloom. I didn't have to. I'd already lived through every moment that led to this. I'd already felt the pain, the humiliation, the quiet suffocation of 8 long years spent as his perfect, invisible wife. Tonight was just the performance's grand finale. When I first met Carter, I was young, idealistic, and stupidly in love. He said he admired my mind, but what he really loved was my usefulness. I was his silent worker, building algorithms, managing his company's back end, organizing his empire while he took all the credit. And I let him. I thought marriage meant partnership. But somewhere along the way, he began treating me like an assistant with a wedding ring. The man who once whispered that I was his muse now couldn't remember my favorite color. Then came the discovery. Late one night, while syncing company files, I stumbled on a hidden folder, Project Phoenix. It was supposed to be his next big expansion. But the documents told a different story. A restructuring plan. My role removed. My shares reassigned. His mistress, Sienna, promoted to chief creative officer. My name erased like I'd never existed. And that's when something inside me snapped. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. I started planning. I reached out to an old college friend, Zoe, a forensic accountant. Together, we built a web, shell companies, hidden transfers, quiet acquisitions. Every asset Carter thought was his was slowly rerouted to me. I learned to smile through the dinners, to nod at his insults, to act clueless while tightening the noose around his empire. So when he called me a failure at my own birthday, I wasn't broken. I was ready. Every deal he bragged about that night, every laugh that echoed through that restaurant, was built on the quicksand I'd laid beneath him. And as I stepped out into the cold night air, leaving behind the sound of his world collapsing, I finally breathed. After years of silence, I wasn't the wife in the background anymore. I was the storm he never saw coming. The morning of my birthday began like every other day, cold, quiet, and predictable. I woke before dawn, as always, moving through the mansion like a ghost. Every step, every sound, every breath was measured. I brewed Carter's coffee precisely the way he liked it. 1.5 spoons of imported beans, water at exactly 185 degrees, served in the monogrammed cup his mother had given him. I plated his breakfast with the precision of a servant trained by fear, not love. 2 eggs, yolks unbroken, crisp bacon arranged in perfect symmetry. It wasn't affection. It was habit, learned obedience from years of being told I was lucky to be his wife. He walked into the kitchen at 7:30 sharp, fresh from his morning run, sweat glistening on his skin, confidence radiating like poison. "You're still here?" he said, glancing at me as if I were part of the furniture. He didn't say good morning. He never did anymore. Instead, he sat, reached for his phone, and began scrolling through emails while I stood silently, waiting for his nod, the unspoken signal that I could finally sit down. But the nod never came. It hadn't for months. The Westchester mansion was beautiful in a way that felt cruel. White marble floors, glass walls, everything polished to perfection, yet frozen and empty. We slept in the same bed, but I may as well have been a shadow beside him. His side smelled of cedar and expensive cologne. Mine smelled like nothing at all. Even our conversations had become rehearsed scripts. He'd ask about company logistics, quarterly reports, new investor proposals. Never once about me. I had long stopped hoping for warmth. I focused on efficiency. As he finished eating, he reminded me, "Don't forget to update the investor summary and finalize payroll for the contractors." His tone was clipped mechanical. I wasn't a wife anymore. I was an assistant who happened to share his last name. When I told him my mother's surgery had been scheduled for the following week, his fork froze midair for a second. "Send money for a nurse," he said flatly. "You don't need to go." She'll be fine. There was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of empathy. My mother had raised me through 2 jobs and a failing marriage, yet to him, she was just another expense. I swallowed hard, pretending it didn't hurt, and nodded. Of course, I whispered. I didn't cry anymore. I had trained myself not to. Crying gave him satisfaction, proof that he still had control. When he left for work, I stood at the window watching his car disappear down the long, manicured driveway. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Every corner of that mansion echoed with everything unsaid, every sacrifice unseen. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and thought, "Happy birthday, Alara." The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one he married. She was quieter, colder, and far more patient than he could ever imagine. He thought I'd spend the day waiting for him. But as the morning light spread through that hollow house, I made myself a silent promise. This would be the last birthday I spent as his obedient illusion. Soon, the perfect routine he depended on would become the perfect cover for his downfall. It was late, close to midnight, when I sat alone in the dim glow of my laptop screen, performing a routine backup of Harrison Capital's servers. It was a task Carter insisted I handle personally, not because he trusted me, but because he didn't want to pay anyone else. I moved through the files like I had hundreds of times before, careful, methodical, detached. Then, in the middle of the corporate maze, I noticed a folder I had never seen before. It was buried 3 directories deep, locked behind an encrypted key. Its name was simple, Project Phoenix. Something about it unsettled me. The name felt deliberate, mocking even. My fingers hesitated on the keyboard for a moment before I opened it. Inside were draft press releases, company restructuring plans, and a brand identity rollout I hadn't approved or even heard about. My pulse quickened as I scrolled through the first document. There, in bold type at the top of the press release, it read, "Harrison Capital proudly announces Sienna Cross as the new Chief Creative Officer." I stared at the name, reading it again and again, hoping it was a mistake. But the more I searched, the clearer it became. This was no oversight. It was a replacement plan. A new organizational chart loaded on the screen. Every position was listed neatly, with lines connecting departments, divisions, and executives. My name was gone, completely erased, like I had never existed. The role I had built from scratch, every system, every design, every innovation, was now labeled as redundant. And Sienna, the woman Carter swore was just a colleague, was positioned as his right hand. My heart sank, but my mind sharpened. I read through every line, forcing myself to absorb the betrayal in full. Further down, I found internal memos between Carter and his partner, Marcus Thorne. They were written in that smug, clinical tone men like them used when discussing something they thought they'd already won. One line burned itself into my mind. "Once the investor meeting is done, we proceed with the transition plan. Her removal will be finalized within the quarter." My removal. They had even scheduled my downfall like a quarterly task. There was no anger at first, only disbelief so deep it felt like silence. Then I found the final file, a confidential document marked Strategic Personal Contingencies. It was a spreadsheet detailing asset transfers, offshore accounts, and a legal strategy to protect Carter's holdings in the event of a divorce. He had listed every property, every account, every piece of intellectual property I'd helped create. All of it was being moved under his name or buried within Shell Corporation's weeks before the planned investor meeting. The preparation was meticulous, ruthless. I could almost hear his voice in the phrasing, detached and efficient, turning betrayal into a business plan. When I finally closed the laptop, the room felt heavier, the air colder. I sat there in silence, staring at the reflection of my own face in the dark screen. For years, I had been the backbone of his empire, and now, he was preparing to erase me like an unwanted line of code. My hands trembled, but I didn't cry. Not this time. Because in that moment, I realized something he hadn't planned for. He had named his secret project Phoenix, a symbol of rebirth. He didn't know he'd just given me mine. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, staring out at the empty driveway, the glow of my laptop still burned into my vision. Every document I'd read replayed in my head. The press releases, the memos, the cold precision with which Carter had planned my disappearance. By dawn, the fear had turned into clarity. I needed help, someone who understood the language of numbers and deception better than I ever could. And I knew exactly who that was. Zoe Morgan, my old roommate from MIT. We hadn't spoken in years, life pulling us in different directions, but I remembered how sharp she was. An expert forensic accountant who once traced millions in hidden assets during a corporate fraud case. I sent her a short message, careful and vague. Need to meet. Urgent. Confidential. Her reply came within minutes. Brooklyn. The Brass Lantern. Tomorrow. 7 p.m. The next evening, I walked into the small, dimly lit bar tucked between a bookstore and a repair shop. The kind of place no one noticed. Zoe was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her posture calm but her eyes alert. She didn't ask about Carter. She just looked at me and said, "You found something, didn't you?" I handed her a flash drive, the weight of it heavier than gold. "Project Phoenix," I said quietly. She plugged it into her laptop, scrolling through the files in silence. The only sounds were the hum of old jazz and the faint clink of glasses. After what felt like an eternity, she leaned back and exhaled. "Elara," she said, "he's not just cheating you emotionally, he's gutting you financially. This is asset stripping. He's moving everything of value before filing for divorce, so by the time it happens, you'll look broke on paper." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were full of restrained anger. "He's planned this for months. Maybe years." I listened, my hands clasped so tightly that my knuckles ached. "Can he actually get away with it?" I asked. Zoe shook her head slowly. "Only if you stay quiet. But if you're smart, and I know you are, you can turn his game against him." She began outlining what she saw: fake entities, transfer trails, offshore accounts under subsidiary names. Every layer of his deceit laid bare. "He thinks he's clever," she said, smirking slightly, "but arrogance always leaves fingerprints." The more she explained, the clearer everything became. Carter had underestimated me. He'd assumed I'd crumble, sign whatever papers he threw my way, and fade quietly into the background. But now I knew the battlefield, the rules, and the weapons. And I had an ally who knew how to wield them. By the time we left the bar, the fear that had shadowed me for days was gone. Zoe placed her hand on my shoulder before we parted. "Don't just survive this," she said. "Own it." Her words settled deep inside me. I walked into the cold Brooklyn night, my heart steady, my resolve sharper than ever. Carter had turned our marriage into a war of control. He thought he was the hunter. But that night, I made a silent vow. I would no longer be his prey. I would become the predator. Once I understood the scale of Carter's deception, something inside me shifted from grief to strategy. I spent weeks pretending everything was normal, smiling at his colleagues, attending charity dinners, hosting luncheons where Sienna's name always floated through conversations like a curse I couldn't speak aloud. But beneath that calm mask, I was building something far more dangerous than revenge. I was building an avalanche. I started with the name. Phoenix Holdings. Simple. Untraceable. Ironically poetic. Using Zoe's guidance, I registered it through a chain of offshore intermediaries, making sure no digital fingerprint led back to me. From there, I created a web of subsidiaries, small consulting firms, lending institutions, and property management fronts. Each had its own paper trail, board of directors, and corporate seal. To anyone on the outside, it looked like a cluster of legitimate entities. But I knew better. Every piece existed for one purpose: to quietly reroute the wealth Carter thought he owned. My first move was toward his family. They were powerful, proud, and above all, greedy. Carter's parents had a sprawling estate north of Westchester, an architectural masterpiece, but financially over-leveraged. Through one of my shell companies, I approached them with a lucrative refinancing offer. It was packaged beautifully: lower interest, flexible terms, minimal risk. I made sure the proposal looked like it came from a respected private lender, one their financial advisor would rush to recommend. They accepted within days. What they didn't realize was that buried within the contract were acceleration clauses, tiny legal tripwires that would trigger immediate foreclosure if Carter's company defaulted on any major loan. And since his company's liquidity depended on the same assets I was quietly siphoning, their stability was now tethered directly to the empire he was about to lose. Next were his sisters, two women who had inherited trust funds larger than most small nations' budgets and believed every cent was permanent. I reached out through Phoenix's financial arm, disguised as an exclusive management service specializing in tax-advantaged restructuring. The pitch was irresistible: higher yields, international diversification, reduced inheritance tax exposure. They signed everything eagerly, never once reading the fine print that linked their trust performance directly to the Harrison family's primary investment pool. The the same pool that Carter had overextended. Zoe helped me audit every transfer, ensuring every move appeared compliant, legal, and invisible. On paper, I was still the quiet, supportive wife managing administrative tasks. In reality, I had turned his network into a domino chain waiting for a single push. Carter had once told me, "You'd be nothing without me." The memory of that sentence played in my mind like a drumbeat as I watched Phoenix Holdings take shape. Each document I signed, each transaction I masked, was another thread tightening around him. By the time the final contracts were signed and filed, I had positioned myself perfectly. One financial tremor in his empire, and everything his family owned would crumble. He thought I was still the obedient wife, fussing over breakfast and reports. But while he slept beside me, I was orchestrating his downfall with the same precision I once used to build his success. The avalanche was ready. All I needed now was the right moment to let it fall. Late one night, hunched over lines of code I had written years ago, I realized the thing that defined the firm, the secret that made their offers believable, was still sitting there like a loaded engine. I had poured sleepless months into that program, teaching it to find patterns no human eye could see, to execute decisions in milliseconds. It had built the firm's reputation. It had built his confidence. And now, watching through a new lens, I saw how I could unmake it. I began by mapping every dependency, every script and subroutine that connected that engine to the rest of their infrastructure. Instead of touching the production servers, I created mirror environments, ghost copies that behaved identically but pointed toward accounts and registries I controlled. It took patience and a careful hand, renaming references, altering handshake protocols, and sewing in new license keys disguised as routine patches. Every change looked like maintenance. Every commit looked deliberate. To get formal approval for these maintenance windows, I drafted change requests and update memos dressed in corporate language so familiar to him. I scheduled calls that sounded mundane: migration plans, compliance checks, vendor meetings. He skimmed the paperwork in the mornings and investor calls, trusting the dry, technical prose because he believed he knew the work's perimeter. I watched him initial line items without reading the fine print. Behind the signatures, I had altered ownership records. Licenses that once pointed to their treasury now referenced opaque trusts and numbered entities I had set up months earlier. Documentation that once listed him as proprietor now contained clauses that transferred control upon routine confirmation. I embedded clauses that triggered on date stamps and system flags, tiny legal gears that turned when specific conditions were met. To anyone auditing superficially, everything appeared kosher. Technically, it was elegant. Ethically, I justified it as reclamation. I had been the architect, writing the logic that produced their profits while he claimed the accolades. I could have walked away, kept my head down, and let him keep the throne he did not deserve. Instead, I rewired the throne so it would fold beneath him when I chose. The evening he signed what he thought were routine approvals, a cascade of transfers began. Authorization tokens I had sutured into the system released control to the entities under my control. Monitoring dashboards flicked from green to amber to crimson as processes redirected and revenue streams rerouted. Traders on the floor called the panic that followed anomalous behavior. Clients emailed furious questions. Board members demanded emergency meetings. He ran through the office like a man whose map had burned. He swore at me in meetings, accused me of sabotage, tried to marshal lawyers to reverse what he called an inside job. But every paper trail led back to contracts he had rubber-stamped, and every license bore my signatures cloaked in plausible deniability. When counsel dug deeper, they found nested agreements and intercompany transfers that obeyed the letter of corporate procedure while violating its spirit. I hadn't wanted to ruin him in front of everyone. I wanted the balance restored. Yet as his empire stuttered under the weight of the very engine he'd exploited, I felt something like relief. The code I had given him to win had become the mechanism of his undoing, and for the first time in years, my labor returned to me as leverage rather than erasure. Carter's arrogance grew in direct proportion to his carelessness. The more secure he felt, the less he tried to hide. He started coming home later, smelling of expensive perfume that didn't belong to me, his excuses thin and half-hearted. "Client dinner," he'd mutter, tossing his watch onto the dresser, the diamond glinting under the light. A week later, I found the receipt: Cartier, 2 bracelets, matching set. When I asked, he smiled without shame. "Corporate gifts," he said, sipping his whiskey. But I knew exactly who they were for. I stopped asking questions. Every confrontation only fed his ego. Instead, I watched, memorizing his patterns. The calls he took in another room, the sudden bursts of laughter when Sienna's name flashed on his phone. He believed I was still that quiet, obedient wife who wouldn't dare look deeper. What he didn't realize was that the more openly he flaunted his betrayal, the more freedom he gave me to act. Then my mother came to visit. Beatrice hadn't been to the house in years. She never liked Carter, but after her surgery, I needed to see her. The moment she stepped into the mansion, she looked around and frowned. "It feels cold here," she whispered. She meant more than the marble floors. Over tea, she watched me with that piercing intuition only mothers have. I kept my answers short, my smile polite. But she saw the truth I tried to hide behind calm composure. When Carter came in, barely acknowledging her before disappearing upstairs, her expression hardened. That night, while he slept in the other room, she quietly entered my bedroom carrying a small suitcase. "You need to start thinking about yourself," she said softly. "Pack the things that matter, documents, a few clothes, the rest can burn." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. I wanted to protest, but no words came. She began folding my clothes, the gesture gentle yet firm, as if packing for both an escape and a rebirth. I realized then she had done this before, for herself, years ago, when she finally left my father's cruelty. Her presence gave me strength I hadn't felt in a long time. 2 days later, the universe sent confirmation I hadn't asked for. A deliverman arrived with an enormous bouquet of lilies, white and fragrant. I froze at the sight. Lilies. The one flower I couldn't stand. The card attached read, "For the woman who makes me feel alive." See, my name wasn't on it. Sienna's was. The handwriting was unmistakably his. The timestamp revealed everything. He had been seeing her for over a year. I stood there holding the bouquet, the scent suffocating me. My mother walked in, took one look at the card, and understood without a word. She took the flowers from my hands and dumped them into the trash. "You don't need to keep proof of poison," she said quietly. That night, as the house fell silent, I sat beside my half-packed bag, running my hand over the zipper. I wasn't ready to leave yet, but I was ready to stop pretending. Carter believed he could flaunt his betrayal and still control the story. But he had no idea that while he was busy showing off his trophies, I was already building the fire that would burn everything he valued. His unraveling had begun. He just didn't know it yet. Carter's tone that evening carried the final insult disguised as authority. "Wear the navy dress," he said without looking up from his phone. "It photographs better." To anyone else, it might have sounded like casual advice, but to me, it was a command, a reminder that in his world, I existed for optics, not presence. I stood before the mirror, smoothing the fabric he chose, realizing I had become part of his decor, an accessory to validate his success. The driver opened the car door with mechanical precision, and I stepped out into the golden glow of the restaurant's entrance. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with calculated laughter, champagne glasses clinking like tiny bells of hypocrisy. Carter was already at the head of the long, polished table, his hand resting lightly on Sienna's chair. Her silver dress shimmered like a deliberate provocation. The place card with my name had been tucked 2 seats away, near people who barely remembered who I was beyond the introduction Carter's wife. The humiliation was quiet but complete. Every detail, the distance, the whispers, the exchanged glances, had been choreographed to make me invisible. I smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, and laughed once too loudly, just to drown the ache pressing against my chest. Beneath the table, my fingers brushed the smooth leather of my evening purse. Inside was a single black envelope, unassuming, but heavier than the crystal glass I held. My pulse thudded in rhythm with its secret. As the dinner unfolded, the air grew colder despite the warmth of the wine and the glow of the chandeliers. Carter's laughter filled the room, echoing like something hollow. Sienna leaned toward him, whispering, touching his arm with casual familiarity, as if daring me to react. Around us, guests played their parts, pretending not to notice the cruelty displayed in plain sight. I caught the eyes of one of Carter's associates, a man who quickly looked away, unable to meet my gaze. The weight of the envelope grounded me. It reminded me that this would be the last night I would ever allow him to script my silence. Every insult, every dismissal, every subtle humiliation had led to this dinner, this performance. He believed the stage belonged to him, that I was too broken to do anything but endure. But beneath my calm expression was a storm waiting for its cue. I took a slow sip of champagne, letting its chill steady my hands. When the waiter approached with the dessert menu, Carter made a show of ordering for me, as always. "She'll have the same," he said without asking. I smiled then, a small, knowing smile that went unnoticed in the noise. My mind replayed every move still to come, every word that would soon turn this celebration into a reckoning. Around me, the guests laughed at something Sienna said. I looked at her reflection in the mirrored wall, then at Carter's proud profile beside her. They had written me out of the picture already. But what neither of them understood was that the real story hadn't even started. Tonight was only the calm before the storm, and I was done waiting for thunder. The clinking of crystal filled the air as Carter rose from his seat, his glass held high like a judge pronouncing a sentence. "Congratulations, failure," he said, his voice slicing through the laughter. The words hung in the air, cruel and deliberate. The crowd erupted, some in awkward chuckles, others in genuine amusement. To them, it was entertainment. To me, it was confirmation that the man I once loved had died long before that night. I didn't flinch. I let the silence after the laughter stretch just long enough to make him believe I was broken again. Then I stood. Every eye followed me as I circled the table with slow, deliberate steps. My heels clicked softly against the marble, the sound steady and calm, like a clock counting down. Carter smirked, thinking he had won. But I wasn't walking toward him. I was walking toward freedom. When I reached the head of the table, I set the black envelope down before him. My voice didn't shake when I said, "Before you celebrate, maybe explain to your parents why their mansion disappears tomorrow, to your sisters why their trust funds are about to freeze, and to your partners why their company is already gone." For a split second, the room went silent. Then came the nervous laughter again, people unsure if I was joking. Carter's smirk faltered. His hand hovered over the envelope. I turned away before he opened it. I wanted him to feel the confusion first, then the dread. The first tear of paper behind me was followed by the first sharp intake of breath. By the time the murmurs turned into panicked questions, I was already halfway to the door. Outside, the night air hit my face like a baptism. I didn't rush. My driver had already brought the car around. As the restaurant lights blurred behind me, I slipped into the back seat and pulled out my laptop. A single login screen waited for me, Phoenix Holdings. One keystroke, and the system came alive. Lines of code scrolled across the monitor like a digital symphony. The automated triggers I had built months ago began their dance. Accounts rerouted, shell corporations activated, proprietary data locks engaged. In seconds, Harrison Capital's infrastructure started to crumble from within. Notifications flooded in, emails bouncing, servers freezing, transaction alerts flashing red. Carter's name popped up in one of the system notifications. He was trying to access restricted files, his own empire locking him out in real time. I watched, expressionless, as the collapse unfolded exactly as planned. The transfer logs confirmed what I already knew. Every asset he had hidden, every account he thought untouchable, was no longer his. For the first time in years, I exhaled without fear. The laughter that had haunted me minutes earlier faded into the distance, replaced by the quiet hum of power under my fingertips. I didn't smile, not yet. This wasn't about satisfaction. It was about reclamation. As the final confirmation appeared, system override completed, I closed the laptop and leaned back against the seat. Behind me, the world Carter built on deceit was burning. Ahead of me, the city lights shimmered like 1,000 open doors. He came to me 3 days later, unshaven and hollow-eyed, pounding on the door of my Brooklyn brownstone like a man who'd finally met his own ghost. When I opened it, Carter looked nothing like the polished executive who had once humiliated me. His designer suit hung loose, his tie undone, his confidence gone. "Ilara, please," he rasped. "You have to stop this. You're destroying everything." His voice cracked on the last word, as if he only now realized what everything really meant. I didn't invite him in right away. I let him stand there, drenched in his own panic, surrounded by the city he'd once thought was his playground. When I finally stepped aside, it was only to end this chapter properly. He stormed into the living room, his tone shifting from pleading to furious. "You've made your point," he said. "I'll have my lawyers undo whatever you did. You'll lose everything too." I smiled faintly. "You already signed it all away," I replied, pulling a slim folder from the desk. Inside were copies of the contracts he'd blindly approved. The patents under my name, the ownership transfers, the digital evidence of his deceit. I pressed play on my phone, and his own voice filled the room. Recordings of him admitting to asset transfers and orchestrated fraud. His face went pale. "You recorded me?" he whispered. "I learned from the best," I said softly. He tried to salvage what little pride he had left. "You can't run a company, Alara. The board won't let you." But the irony of it was already in motion. That same morning, the board of Harrison Capital had reached out to me, desperate to stop the total collapse. Their once celebrated leader had become a liability. They wanted stability. They wanted me. Within 48 hours, I was offered controlling ownership to restore investor confidence. I didn't hesitate. I took it, not out of mercy, but as a final act of dominance. Then I dismantled it piece by piece, selling the company's assets for more than Carter had ever imagined possible. Every transaction felt like reclaiming a heartbeat I'd lost during our marriage. With the proceeds, I built something new, something that wasn't born from revenge but from vision. I named it Athena Analytics, a data firm built to give women like me the power and recognition we'd been denied for too long. My first hires were women Carter once ignored in boardrooms, the ones whose ideas he'd stolen and repackaged as his own. Together, we built something resilient and real. Months later, I stood in my new office, glass walls overlooking the skyline. The morning light spilled across my desk, warm and steady. My reflection stared back from the window. Not the timid wife who once waited for permission to exist, but a woman who had burned her own path from the ashes. Carter had taken everything I thought I needed. But in losing him, I had found something far greater. My freedom, my purpose, and the kind of peace that no empire could ever buy.